this series contains references to child sexual abuse, which some listeners may find distressing. Hi, I'm Liz Hull. In October 2012, the town of Rochdale in Greater Manchester made headlines when a police detective named Maggie Oliver dramatically quit her job. She left to publicly blow the whistle on the way her police force was failing to investigate gangs of Asian men who were grooming and sexually abusing underage girls.
I can remember him saying to me, Maggie, calm down. Look, let's be honest, what are these kids ever going to contribute to society? They should have been drowned at birth.
Maggie accused top officers at Greater Manchester Police and senior social workers at Rochdale Council of deliberately turning a blind eye and allowing paedophiles to exploit some of the most vulnerable children in their community. Now, more than 10 years on from the scandal, and after multiple investigations and reports into what went wrong, the authorities insist lessons have been learned and that police today are better equipped to tackle these sort of crimes. But the grooming gangs, which have blighted Britain's towns and cities, are once again at the centre of political debate, as the Labour government rejects demands for a public inquiry aimed at finally stamping them out. So this begs the question, have lessons really been learned? In this 3-part series, we're going to look a bit deeper into whether that's truly the case by hearing from those who've been inside this murky criminal underworld of child sex abuse. We'll talk exclusively to grooming victim Scarlett West and her father Marlon, who tell us about the shocking series of events that pushed her into the clutches of one of these grooming gangs. How the gang's pernicious influence resulted in her repeatedly going missing from home, prompted her expulsion from school, and eventually resulted in her being taken away from her family and into care. We'll hear how Marlon knew his daughter was being exploited by older men and reported her missing to police over 50 times. How he also supplied them with evidence of who was abusing her and where it was happening. But despite this, no arrests were ever made or any of the men prosecuted. Instead, we'll hear that Scarlett herself ended up being repeatedly arrested and even subjected to inhumane treatment at the hands of police officers, including being forced to take part in a strip search when she was only 14 years old. This is On the Case, The Grooming Gangs, Episode 1. We'll be back in just a moment. Hello, I'm Liz Hull from The Mail. I'm one of the hosts of our award-winning podcast, The Trial, and I've been reporting on criminal cases from all over the UK for more than 20 years. The Trial takes you inside the courtroom, and over the past couple of years, we've covered some of the most high-profile cases making the headlines, including the trial of serial baby murderer Lucy Letby, the killers of Brianna Ghey, and the man guilty of plotting to kidnap and murder Holly Willoughby. It's a groundbreaking, unique series, and I'm proud that we've brought court reporting to a whole new audience. But as a journalist, I'm acutely aware that we can't cover every case, and of course not all crime stories play out in front of a judge. In fact, some of the most shocking and intriguing cases I cover never make it to trial at all. So on this brand new podcast, we're leaving the courtroom and going out into the big bad world. Each series will explore a different case, harnessing the brilliant journalism of the Daily Mail and Mail on Sundays, award-winning crime reporters and investigation team. Each episode I'll be joined by one of my colleagues, whose determined and dogged reporting has got them exclusive access to the detail of what happened and the people at the heart of the story. Welcome to On the Case, Season 1, The Grooming Gangs. Joining me for Season 1 is James Tozer. James, how are you doing?
Hi Liz, I'm good, thanks, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So can you just tell us a little bit more about the story that we're going to be hearing about this season?
Yes, so essentially at one level, it's one girl's story about how she went from being a normal teenager to becoming a victim of grooming gangs when she was only 14 years old. She would end up being sexually abused by groups of men in dingy hotels across the north of England. But instead of being treated like a victim, she was arrested and degraded by the police, who subjected her to being strip searched again when she was only 14. But in a wider sense, it's the story of how this crime has continually fallen through the cracks of the justice system and social services. And this is all more than 10 years after police detective Maggie Oliver blew the whistle on these very things. So it does raise serious questions about what has in fact changed.
That sounds really fascinating, James. So just tell us, who exactly are we going to be hearing from?
In October of last year, I went to interview Scarlett West and her dad Marlon, who works as an advanced nurse practitioner. Scarlett was still under the control of her groomers until as recently as 2 years ago. For a long time, Marlon was helpless as his daughter was continually abused because all his pleas for help fell on deaf ears. So he's been campaigning for a public inquiry into the way police tackle grooming gangs and wants a national strategy developed. So they're both very well placed to tell us about the current state of things, and quite frankly, it's damning.
Okay, so let's get into this. Let's go straight to the interview and hear from Scarlett and Marlon.
So could you talk a bit about what kind of a girl you were before all this started?
Yeah, so I went to like a good school, had a good group of friends. I was always a bit of the loud one of the group, but I was never a bad kid. I was just like the loud one in that group, but I was always dead good. Like I never got at school. I think I had a few detentions for silly things, but I'd never swore at a teacher. I always did my homework. I was pretty good at school and stuff as well.
So when she was younger, she was great. She was brilliant. She initially went to private school. Later, she went to a Church of England primary school. No problems with her at all. She was willful, but very funny. She was in more or less all the top sets. On the weekends, she had a horse. And one of my motivations for that, even though I absolutely skimmed it, was to keep her off the streets.
I'd prefer to go and see my horse than actually go out with my friends. Like my friends would go on the park at the weekend, you know, like on a summer's day, and I'd go to the farm instead. Like I loved it.
And at that stage, have you any kind of recollection of how you would see the future? Did you have an idea of where you would be in the future?
As long as I can remember, I'd always wanted to be a police officer. Not in the horse bit or anything, just like a normal police officer, and then work my way up into whichever department I wanted to go in. But that's always what I wanted to do.
And what influenced you into having that aspiration of becoming a police officer?
I don't know, it's just a very hands-on job. Like, you see a lot of things and you never sat in an office, you know, writing, and I just feel like it'd be good for me and I wanted to help other people.
During this period of her childhood, when she was dreaming of becoming a police officer and tending to her horse, Scarlett lived with her dad Marlon, who was her primary carer, as her mum had left the family home a few years earlier. What sort of a parent do you think you were at this time?
I think I was a pretty good parent. I had to work. I've always worked full time to pay the mortgage, to put food on the table. I'd always make sure she's safe. I'd always pick her up from the stables. Occasionally she would stay at friends' houses who were horse friends.
And at this point in time, did you have any conception of grooming, of sexual abuse? And if so, could you ever have imagined that Scarlett could be a victim of something like that?
So as far as grooming, yeah, I was aware of it. And that was because I worked for many years at the drug team in Oldham. So we'd had dealings with it as a team professionally. So I was aware of grooming, but not for 1 minute would I ever consider Scarlett being groomed.
And why did you not think that she could be a victim of something like that?
Because, in all honesty, it's usually, or I thought it was at the time, more poverty-stricken parents, problematic parenting, where there was already concerns about the risk to the child and that general stereotyping. I hold my hands up. I was definitely one of them person.
Despite her middle-class upbringing and having a father who was more clued up than most on the realities of grooming, when Scarlett was 13 years old, an unforeseeable chain of events would set her on a path that would eventually lead her to the groomers.
So her and a friend were going trick-or-treating. A friend's mother was going to pick her up, collect her, the pair of them from High Bus Station at 8 o'clock, and then drop her back off at my house. Scarlett didn't return till about 9 o'clock. I was ringing everybody, because again, that was our character. And then the mother brought her home and then actually told me what had happened. So Scarlett had been attacked in the bus station. She had a superficial cut to her neck where one of the lads had put a knife against her throat. And that evening, luckily, it was raining quite hard, but they'd actually tried to set a coat on fire. So the fur on the hood was all singed and burnt. I had to throw the coat away. That was the critical point where everything changed. Even a change in character within a week, everything changed then.
This was when I was still at school, and I knew of this group for like being the local idiots. So after they jumped me that I thought I'd prefer to be friends with these people than anyways, because I was terrified. I wouldn't go out my house, I wouldn't get on the bus, because there was only one bus to my house at the time, and all these kids that jumped me got on it all the time, every day. I mean, they used to like vandalise buses. The bus on the estate where I lived, it actually had to be stopped because bus drivers had refused. Like, they just used to terrorise the estate and everyone, so I just thought I prefer to be in with this group than out of it.
I didn't think for 1 minute that I should get involved with the gang, especially after being assaulted by him.
After the attack on Halloween, Scarlett began to spend more and more time with the gang. But a few months later, her decision to become friends with them would backfire in a devastating way when one of the gang members raped her, and things just got worse and worse.
In the October 2018, when I got jumped and the rape happened, them times I did go to the police and I did really reach out for help. I did loads of interviews. I did everything they asked me to. I gave them my clothes, everything. And they didn't get charged with nothing and just got let out. And after they all got let out, the rapist and the people who jumped me, it was just 10 times worse than it was before, because I was known as a grass then. And I obviously got promised this protection off the police if I spoke up. And they didn't protect me. After that, I wouldn't even speak to them about anything.
The police did nothing really. I also reported it to the doctor. There was no kind of counselling, any kind of emotional support offered.
At first, I didn't say it really bothered me, and then something just switched in my head. I don't know what it was, but I just changed after that. I just changed my attitude, the way I was towards my dad, the way I thought about school, just everything in general about me changed.
The attack and the rape clearly had a profound effect on Scarlett. Something shifted, and it was during this vulnerable time that she was introduced to someone who would gradually draw her further into the murky criminal underworld with catastrophic consequences. And I think there was a particular woman who came into your life who was central to what we now term as the grooming, the exploitation that happened to you. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this group that I got involved with that jumped me, I ended up getting raped by someone out of this group. I still had good friends at this time, but they were distant. But anyway, I told one of my friends that this had happened to me, and she said, look, my sister has been through the same thing. She's a bit older than you, but like, she's been raped quite a few times. She's had, awful things happen to her. Maybe you could relate to her, speak to her. So that's how I got introduced to this girl. So I think I just got led in by that, having someone I could talk to. And then again with that, it just escalated. So at first I'd just go and see her, like smoke a fag together or whatever, or go for food. And it was just like that, and would speak. And then slowly I started going missing, staying at her address, going out with her, doing things she did. But at the time she was 19 and I was 14, so the things she was doing I shouldn't have been doing, but I was just doing that anyway to be with her. I thought she was my friend, and to be honest with you, at the time I didn't even realise what was going on.
Scarlett became increasingly close to this older girl, who she described as a top dog in the gang. This older girl was friends with those younger members that had attacked Scarlett, both physically and sexually, but she also knew the older, more sinister figures, the drug dealers and groomers, and seemingly she took Scarlett under her wing.
They'd listened, if she said to one of her friends, tell them to leave Scarlett alone, they'd listen because she was older. So I felt like I kind of got that respect, from being with someone older. And I used to think I was well cool at the time, like driving around in fast cars with older people. Like no one did that at my age. And I used to think I was proper cool. Like I used to post it on my stories and stuff. I think my friends will see, they'll be so jealous. But in reality, that wasn't what they seen on my Snapchat stories, wasn't what was going on.
So it sounds absolutely awful, James, the way that she was dragged into this gang. But actually, people might be fairly shocked because Scarlett isn't what you would maybe parents may think as a typical grooming victim. She's from a good home. She had a supportive father. She, described as fun-loving, loved going out, tending to her horse. She's not the kind of typical victim that you might assume gets involved in this terrible world.
Absolutely. No, that's exactly what makes it such an unusual insight into this into this problem, and she speaks very vividly about it. I think we can really get a sense of the way that, as you say, children from all sorts of backgrounds, it could just be a one-off incident, and suddenly their life path could change. And you can see the way in which these groups operate and the way that they look for some vulnerability or some opportunity, and they can suddenly start to begin the process of exploiting a young girl.
Yeah, because she obviously has this serious incident where she's jumped on Halloween and threatened with the knife, and she almost joins this group of people to protect herself. And then obviously that backfires spectacularly when she's raped herself and then introduced to a girl who's only a few years older than her and is also no doubt a victim, but she kind of leans on her for protection even more.
That's right. And what's even more disturbing is that having found herself starting to be sucked into this sort of world, as we'll hear from Marlon, it began to feel as though Scarlett was being treated as part of the problem rather than a young girl who desperately needed help.
So we'll hear a bit more about that after the break. So before the break, we heard all about how Scarlett came from a good middle-class background, but how the attack on Halloween when she was 13 triggered her life to change course, and she was gradually drawn into this terrible world of grooming gangs. James, we're going to hear more now from your interviews with Scarlett and Marlon.
Thanks, Liz. So Marlon had never had any problems with Scarlett growing up. He was a single father, going out to work, but when she suddenly had a new group of friends and her behaviour changed and she started going missing from home, it began to dawn on him that something serious was going on.
I had concerns. I was possibly at the beginning in denial because that's never going to happen to my daughter. But once the missing from home started, which is a massive early warning sign, then I started thinking it, and then I started asking questions.
You say you were in denial. Were there warning signs that, looking back, predating that?
Yeah.
And what were they?
She started disengaging from the horse. I get phone calls from the stable, Scarlett's not been tonight. And again, I think at the beginning, I just thought, oh, she's getting bored with it. She's becoming a teenager. And I kind of passed it off. But in hindsight now, and reflecting back on it, that were the first signs. And she'd lied to me. So the lies started as well.
As well as going missing from home and lying to her father, Scarlett's behaviour also started to change. And this was when they had their first of many dealings with social services.
She became really aggressive, extremely aggressive. So when social services first got involved, she tried leaving the house quite late at night. I'd be saying, as a parent, you're not going out at this time. She was 13 years old when this started happening. And I stopped her one night. She assaulted me. She started attacking me. Because of the nature of my profession, I have to do mandatory training for restraining. So I did restrain her. I didn't hurt her, didn't bruise her, but I did restrain her because she was attacking me. She went to school the next day and told school that I'd beaten her up and I'd assaulted her. So there was a police investigation. I was suspended from work. The police investigated it straight away. I told them exactly what I'd done. The police agreed with me that I was legally able to protect myself. They did physical check on Scarlett. There was no bruising and she'd not come to any harm. And that was the reason for doing it, if I'm honest, because I didn't want her to get into any harm going out late at night. Social services took about 6 weeks to do their investigation, which meant that I couldn't return to work. They put her on the child in need because of what I'd done. And then at the end of it, they said, "Oh, we're really sorry about this, but yeah, you're right. There's nothing for you to call for." And then they discharged her.
But Marlon was still struggling, and he asked social services to remain involved because he desperately needed their support. And it was at this time, while they were waiting for a social worker to be assigned to Scarlett's case, that she started going missing overnight.
So it started at weekends initially. She was still at school. So it started on a Friday night. She'd gone out with her friends and then just didn't return. I contacted the police, reported her missing. So I think at that time, I give it till about midnight. I've been driving around, I've been ringing all her other friends. Hysterical, if I'm honest with you, because it was the first time it had happened. The police came. To be fair, the first time she went missing, the police came, they took it really serious because it was out of character.
And although, as a young child, Scarlett had thrived at school, once she was attacked and fell in with the gangs, she started being disruptive in class and her education inevitably began to suffer.
Like I said, I've always been like the loud one of the group, so I'd be a bit of a class clown, but nothing bad. Like I'd make a few comments and stuff, I'd be the funny one. And that's what it was like for year 7 and 8. I think I'd not even had a detention year 7 and 8, so everything was fine. And then I think it's when I got to year 9 I started messing around a bit more. But this was obviously after I was jumped as well, so my head wasn't in the right place. And I had one teacher at school who, she really vouched for me, she'd try and get me out of the trouble. I loved her and I still think about her to this day, like she was so good. And she did everything she could to keep me there. And I'll be honest, there was a new deputy head teacher, and I think he'd just come along. He'd seen I'd got diagnosed with this ADHD and the school was quite academic. So if there's any naughty kids, they will just get rid of them straight away. And I had this teacher, on my side for so long. And then when this new deputy come along, I just don't think he'd put up with it anymore. And I think they just wanted rid, to be honest.
And what was formally happening? Were you suspended, excluded, transferred?
So they put me in isolation, and obviously because I've got my ADHD diagnosis now, the isolation, it wasn't good for me. They'd put me in for like a week at a time. So then it got to the point, I didn't want to go to school, but I'd always go. I'd never not turn up to school, like I've never skived a day, so I'd still go. But it just was not good for my head because they wanted me to be punished for whatever I'd done. And I was refusing to go in this isolation, or I'd walk out because I couldn't do it. And that's where like the problems properly started, I'd say.
So I was getting constant phone calls from school. To be fair, some of them were ridiculous phone calls, but they were concerned about the change in her behaviour. Although I'm saying concerned, there was more concerned about a disrupting the class. They weren't concerned about her emotional well-being. They would just put it down to her age and say it's behavioural.
And how did that progress over the course of year 9?
Her behaviour was something what they call low-level disturbance. So she wasn't a risk to other children. She wasn't a risk to members of staff. She was just disruptive in class. Then I was getting phone calls, and I'm in work and I'm running a clinic at this point. She's thrown a piece of paper on the floor. It just seemed they were using any excuse to call me and then bring me in for a meeting. And in the end, they permanently excluded her for low-level disturbance, which shouldn't have happened.
At this point, Scarlett was getting more and more involved with the gangs, and the older girl who had taken her under her wing. Getting excluded from school could not have come at a worse time.
So I felt that they didn't help the situation because they were kicking me out then and excluding me. So then I'd be sat at home on my own all day while all my good friends were at school. And then parents started speaking, so I wouldn't be invited to parties, birthday parties and stuff. So I started getting left out in that way. I was bored at home, my dad was at work, I had nothing to do. I'd say it's from me being excluded from school that started it off. If I weren't excluded, I would have been all right because I would have been at school, not at home. I think that's when I started just engaging in like risky behaviour. Just got worse, like being in cars with older men, drugs, weapons. It just escalated very quickly. From this girl, that was at school doing well, went to a good school, to a year later that I'd been stabbed, I'd been set on fire, I'd been jumped. I'd had all these awful things happen to me just from hanging around with these people in such a short space of time.
So poor Scarlett, James, to have her life go into such a downward spiral so fast. She's obviously really traumatised by the attack on Halloween and then the subsequent rape. And it seems to just hit her, and it kind of manifests itself in her behaving badly at school. But the worst thing they could have done was to expel her and kick her out and leave her bored in the daytime on her own, right for these gangs to come and take advantage of her even more.
Exactly. And you hear how passionate Marlon was, how angry he still is about that, because from his work, he knew about the dark side of towns and cities like the area where Scarlett was living. And he could just see unfolding in front of him that his young daughter, in just a matter of months, was suddenly in a position where she was open to falling prey to them.
And like you said, James, she speaks so eloquently about it. It's hard to kind of remember, isn't it, that she's still, so young. And I think, things go from bad to worse, which we're going to hear about in the next episode. So we're going to just leave it there for today. But thanks so much. Join us for the next episode of On the Case, where we'll hear the next part of Scarlett and Marlon's story, including how she was ferried to men all over the north of England, and how instead of helping her desperate father to save her, the police began arresting her instead, and she ended up alone and being strip-searched in a police cell.